China, English, Education by Sean McHugh, May 2026, Part 5 of 5. Chinese and other non-Westerners tend not to bother getting spelling right if they find a botched phonetic alternative, where their undeveloped languages and societies are incommensurate with the detailing in English that supports advanced conceptualization as underwriting the modern world and its huge material advantages. Indeed, modern English emerges in the 16th century, exactly contemporary with the scientific revolution, but throughout the whole period up until the American rapprochement in the 70s, and for most of the culture continuing to the present, reality instead is assumed to be simple. Before the recent Pinyin Chinese Roman transliteration, there was no Chinese spelling, nor written indication of the tones. While people still have to think hard to write tones above the pinyin, for a non-speaker when not using software for it, use of Chinese is based only on echoing of outward sound they hear from each other, all as with uncritically echoing official views, and not a written objective reference. There is groupthink, and accordingly national sequestration away from the world, with intermittent national self-inflicted insanities, not independent checking and language with objective logic that can then apply to an objective external reality. Non-phonetic script connotes herd mentality and outward android programming that only simulates consciousness, with the formal symbol manipulation of computers, where they never know what the information they process means. While phonetics connotes subsurface understanding and reflection, and hence personal interiority and individuality. English further has a deceptively straightforward and adaptable grammar, but which has its own logic, allowing it also to progress to dealing with content of great intricacy and density. The world's limited number of native and ethnic Western English-speaking countries, despite their dialectical differences, internalize this complexity, as non-Western second language learners unwittingly don't, and hence natives understand that even simple English needs to be written well or it looks ridiculous. Non-Westerners, having no experience of and being unaware of the hidden complexity in simple expression in English, assume that any low standard will do as long as it communicates the matching basic content that they're familiar with. They take the grammatical flexibility to mean the language is easy and arbitrary, rather than subsequently reaching into unknown deeper meaning. The elastic syntax provides for learners reaching a rudimentary conversational level with limited study, whereas other languages have more obvious complexity built in to begin with, and non-Western learners then assume all the more that they've quickly mastered English. Its adaptability makes it the ideal world's common language, while leaving it misunderstood. English learners in many non-Western countries then often benightedly argue for their ideas about the language being equivalent to those of first-language countries, because their ideas are assessed under simpler criteria than English actually pertains to. They hold that English being a global language means its non-native usages have equal importance, but only because they don't understand that those ideas or usages are at a low level of meaning and complexity. Gibberish masquerades as relativity of language, with the view that international standard English is no such thing, and instead completely malleable. By contrast, it's only malleable when retained within the simple conceptual working and level of meaning circumscribed by their low linguistic standards that non-Westerners know. These are intellectually simpler minds situated in pre-modern cultural backgrounds that never had the intellectual movements that created modernity. Tremendous potential for accuracy, expression, and investigation is embedded, where even the simplest sentences are subject to being well-written or not, and where an indefinitely greater understanding of the world can issue forward. Chinese language, however, both expresses the initial mental scope and characteristics of the people creating it, while containing anything further, such that they never have experience of deeper complexity in conceptual thought, nor implicitly complex grammar. These indeed are irrelevant to their simple daily concerns, and hence they don't recognize any problem with mistakes pointed out, and instead see them as meaningless and respond with incredulity.
Americans or Australians, for example, may do interesting things with grammar and stress patterns in reapplying, but not breaking the subtle logic involved, while the Chinese are scarcely aware of the logic at all, as making their second language, English, low-grade, crude, and often entirely meaningless. Most non-Western cultures don't indicate why a simple use of language for dealing with simple concepts in a simple, undeveloped society might leave something important missing. There is little awareness on any level of how a potential for deeper accuracy, expression, and flexibility can translate into hugely more developed conceptual thinking and societies.
The Chinese English staff feel strain between the directives from above for English language experts and their deep-rooted presupposition out of their language that any language consists in or can be treated as little more than a pigeon for getting across simple ideas. They don't want to discuss English with Westerners, as any implication arising that there are serious issues here is too much for them, and instead, our English has to be no better than theirs, and our presence privately regarded as unnecessary or at best confusing. Chinese characters providing minimal guiding reference for speaking, and instead the criterion for pronunciation as parroting the sound of others' pronunciation, translates to a neurotic self-referential vortex of groupthink and socialist theoretical values. The tones help make the sounds unique and distinguishable to compensate for the deficiency in literary support, although this extra difficulty for foreigners learning Chinese adds to the national isolation. For Chinese literacy, thousands of characters as complete words have to be tediously memorized, whereas Western constituent letters can, as necessary, be phonetically read, at the same time as seeing the word in terms of a symbol to read at a glance. Chinese characters also take time to write and must be separate, not cursive, as further slowing thinking down, and in parallel with learning generally as piece-by-piece memorizing and copying. Cursive writing tends to free up time to help think inwardly, while phonetics, as breaking processes down, helps think deeper. Moreover, artificial intelligence translation is reducing both the need to understand linguistic differences, or any of these issues, along with the whole demand for studying and teaching English. The limited difference between spoken and written Chinese compared to spoken and written English, where writing is closer to a simple transcript of colloquial speech without the implicit need for carefully organized conceptual complexity and clarity, means there is both no reading culture as something different to speaking, and then no proofreading involving detailed inward thinking and checking. People only ask others how to say words instead of finding out more objectively, and subsequently only ask others how to understand anything instead of finding out more objectively. This is also while knowing only a few thousand characters to make literacy levels equivalent to a Western child, and providing another parallel between the socialist society and the undeveloped and permanent dependent childhood condition. For the Chinese, writing is a matter of getting regular casual speaking into a script where the notion that such rough meaning to begin with could be ridiculous or stupid doesn't arise. Writing having finer characteristics is outside their comprehension, even while this is perfectly understood by 500 million native English speakers with more conscious minds, and only if they've lived in a native-speaking country for a lengthy period do they even begin to notice. Even Chinese university deans write idiotic English for public use and have no idea about it. Translations are often made word or character direct for an English word, with no concern for different grammar, as though the English is for local Chinese speakers to understand. And once the translation departs from standard international English too much, then it doesn't make sense to any non-Chinese English speaker in the world that it was for. Nonetheless, in some cases, perhaps more long-winded English communicates better to basic-level speakers with limited vocabulary. For instance, pedestrian across the street channel, as translated word for rough word, might work better than subway or underpass, yet the expression and grammar could still be far better while there is no water involved. In any language, a speaker communicates with casual formations and continues explaining until the listener understands. But finished written English has an exactitude, rigor, and concentration in closed sentences, providing an idealized expression and storage system for perusal by readers at their own pace, where they may stop and reread sections as necessary. A speaker keeps checking that the listener understands and adjusts accordingly, but the writing process can't check the reader understands, and instead must just be written well, at least for complex content. Moreover, an exact transcript of informal English speaking may not communicate well, in missing the live and dynamic mind-to-mind component. Then, to improve spoken English, the Chinese have the idea of reading from a book aloud, a skillful and demanding process for anyone, but not reading inwardly to address the implicit complexity the writing exposes and create the abstract understanding needed. I never met a student of English working towards an exam who got hold of and read good native English written books of interesting content and to further their proficiency, despite me explaining to them at the start of every course, because they don't have the necessary mental apparatus for taking such interest. Nonetheless, another explanation for non-Western reluctance to use a Western language correctly, with its cultural and psychological specifics in Apollonian rationality, is its nature as a foreign imposition. The colonial period, even in its limited impact in China, took centuries to overcome, and contemporary English, although being the pragmatic international common language across much of the world, is seen as another invasive process. If a language and society only deal with simple issues like the sack of corn is over there, and the translation is only to deal with strange Westerners, so that people can get back to their simple ways, then such small mistakes may not matter because simple understanding is still derivable. In similar bonhomie Chinese disregard, pairs of letters and words are typically casually written the wrong way round, while the numbers 7 and 1 can be interchanged because they look similar. However, if the criticality of a language and the people issuing it allows complex discussions, like Kantian deontological ethics, contrasted with classical utilitarianism from a postmodern perspective, then these will become impossible with such small mistakes, as at this point they interfere with and preclude the complexity and articulation of meaning the discussion involves. The listener can understand speaking that has relatively poor sentence construction, confused information order, and numerous other problems, because their mind is holding it together for a while and sorting it out intuitively. But writing that has such problems, as a fixed and definite record, quickly becomes irretrievable nonsense beyond conveyance of basic concepts. English writing's implicit exacting complexity and expression have to be understood and content made sense of in these terms and nothing less, unless the writer really doesn't mind their content, whether simple or attempted complex, being understood as benightedly foolish and stupid by native speakers, and often by other second language speakers, beyond and unfamiliar with the writer's linguistic terms. With the background assumption that language generally has no depth structure or special capacity to discriminate and then elaborate more abstract ideas, English and other Western languages are learnt as a second language only up to the point before this, as commensurate with the learner's first language and culture. Beyond this, improvements that would allow further complexity aren't recognized or suspected to be any such thing, but just unimportant matters of dialect or style. It's impossible to convey to Chinese English department management, unless they've had the experience of native-speaking countries, that their English is junk and unfit for purpose, regardless of how carefully you explain, and may take you to be playing one-upmanship or belittling them for no reason. Indeed, they may muse to you that native speakers often have this wayward opinion. Most native speaker staff, however, won't say anything at all, and instead abdicate professional responsibility and duty to both the students and institution.
Typically in signage, and the selection even of single words for public use shows innocence of English complexity and the need to check writing first so it doesn't become a derisory laughingstock. For example, on many thousands of ATM machines of the huge ABC Bank all over China, the word correct for one of the buttons is brainlessly wrong and confuses all and anyone trying to understand in English. Someone at some point, when meaning delete or error, moronically chose the opposite word from a Chinese translation book.
They were thinking of its minor use and different context of, would you like to correct this? And then for many years off into the future, or forever, this continues and is thought not just fine, but can't possibly be wrong, because any language is just a simple thing. The bank has the resources to get this checked properly, but the background low consciousness defines the situation where nothing beyond crude Chinese thinking, language, and society is comprehensible. Similar erroneous single-word signs include in train stations, train for platforms, or in department stores, book for booksellers, again issuing from having no idea of writing and thinking reaching beyond block characters as rough and casual spoken words in a pre-modern society. Straying from international standard English undermines meaning for non-Chinese second language speakers, unfamiliar with the particular Chinese terms of simplification and violation. English soon becomes unintelligible to all without international reference in the use of this international language. But this is intolerable for self-sufficient socialism and pride, where the state must be the arbiter. Other examples of signage idiocy I saw included after the meal not shift at a fast food restaurant to mean after ordering please wait nearby to be served, and based experimental center of computer at a university information technology building to mean computer center. Both, as usual, were prepared on expensive, high-quality metal signs, without the slightest thought that they might need checking first. Again, explaining politely to university management that such signs around the campus are fantastic nonsense and cultural vandalism gets the polite answer back that they'd like to speak with me more on this topic, followed, of course, by nothing. Chinese formations transferred across to English further need sensitivity because the more holistic and more delineated contexts clash, where languages serve the cultures issuing them, and become highly incongruous when put to other cultures' uses. Non-Westerners want to engage with economically more successful Westerners and their common language, but don't often understand the extent of the differences. Moreover, in English, to show agreement to negatively structured questions and statements, as featuring not or no, the sentiment is matched where the speaker says no and not yes. For instance, doesn't it work? No. Or, I'm not wrong, am I? No. Or, there's no one else here? No. The formation in regular conversation is part of checking what the other speaker is saying, and has high frequency of occurrence, up to every few seconds, but is difficult for the Chinese, although not seemingly impossible as it is for the Koreans. When a speaker says yes, and the listener agrees, they also say yes. But when a speaker says no, and the listener agrees, they similarly say no, so that they're saying the same thing, and never yes, where if instead it is yes, they must begin again and explain. Here, no is treated differently to yes, and just shows parallel sentiment. But the Chinese see it all in terms of mathematics, where yes is positive and no negative. For them, only one negative makes all positives negative. So instead of saying no, 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 they say no, yes, 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 while always laughing at the formation across two speakers of, for example, are there no drinks here? No, no, no. They assume multiple no's from one or more speakers are like a series of negative numbers multiplied together, where the results alternate between negative and positive. But if such mathematics was English, then the series would stay negative, all as a series of yeses stays yes, or positive stays positive. They think it's a joke not to take the first no heard as full and final, in parallel with the peremptory authoritarian culture, and assume that a sentence like, "No, it doesn't. No, not at all," means no, then yes, then no, then yes, instead of the three negatives after the first one just reinforcing it. Hence, in English, the formation, "Are we working tomorrow? No," to their surprise, morphs into, "Aren't we working tomorrow? No," because in the second case here, of a negative question, the no isn't an independent negative, but contextually presupposed as just showing congruence with, or confirmation for, the questioner. No means that the questioner is right and not wrong. Yes and no are the first words learned in a new language, but Chinese still get them wrong under English's emergent complexity right from the start, while it's disturbing to see a tangle of sentiments in their mixed-up replies. Saying yes when agreeing with negativity, or seeing them still nodding even when taught to say no, brings a weird positive and upbeat response to statements like, "He may not recover from his injuries," while aligning with China's basic schizophrenic socialist detachment from human nature, along with the source of its high technology. Aligned with this is the frequent intentional and bizarre, if guileless, conflation of the words can and can't in speech, and the stating of things as supposed to be rather than in definite terms.
The yes and no zigzagging aligns with indirect and lateral ways of proceeding, which often reflect sensible moderation and temperance, but also become an excuse for the inability for linear, straight thinking and securing goals effectively. The government endlessly puts up and takes down barriers, including opening and closing shops as part of people control, while causeways over water in pleasure gardens, for example, always zigzag for people to pause and note the view as they go. There's further a process of circling outward for progressively greater lateral inclusion of others, rather than just the individual and their linear and perhaps selfish action towards goals independent of the environment. For most Chinese, everything defining persons and their understanding, or rather unpersons and their lack of understanding, is assumed to come from without, where they comprise blanks for programming and dummies for taking orders, rather than individuals respected for inward expertise. Thence, even Chinese English teaching staff, who've lived for several years in English-speaking countries and gained something deeper, advise me they're not valued for it and given no priority over low-standard Chinese English staff who have never left the country. Nothing beyond dreary superficiality in language is assumed to exist. The idea of having something to say or be focused on is beyond the Chinese mind, and English writing, whether in departmental and institution literature or from students, is snarled up jumbles of ideas and incoherent collections of phrases taken to look nice for brainless auditory or course assessment purposes. The whole logical process that English gives shape to and connotes back to the writer doesn't arise in Chinese mentality and its issuing language, and they perceive any writing only as a matter of learning rules to express what is already presupposed around them, and not for investigation or thinking. Language isn't for thought-provoking content or argumentation with directed point-making, and the average Chinese doesn't have the higher critical capability for it, nor to recognize or engage with anything interesting of their own in life, while the average Westerner isn't quite as dull and empty. Similarly, without the understanding of English of native speakers, having internalized greater implicit complexity than most non-Westerners have from their languages, students and others often disagree with me over basic issues. For instance, saying that they have a friend who did well in an English exam who says that the feature that I'm advising them of isn't what I say. They explain to me, "So thanks anyway, but I have a superior understanding than you here, and we can move on," while I struggle to keep my face straight. Students likewise prioritize attending their courses with their miserable Chinese coursebooks full of nonsense over direct tuition with a native speaker that I might offer, all as Chinese English staff only stay with their presuppositions and likewise never engage with native speakers on English issues. A further teaching issue is rooms across China typically provided with a recessed ceiling design, inadvertently giving dome effects as shattering and blurring the sound of any speaking.
The increased logical emphasis in English sentences with premises, conclusions, architectonics, and closure, along with analogous stress patterns in phrases and words, challenges the muddled backwards and forwards features of Chinese culture and language, and undermines Chinese identity. However, learners being alive to only minimal depth structure also tend to think that the basic differences, and then errors, as circumscribing potential meaning, aren't basic, but instead only issues of surface local dialect, where the garbled rubbish of failing to recognize difference properly is equivalent to American or British English. By contrast, carefully written or spoken American English has dialectical difference with British, but doesn't revise basic syntax and logic, such that the tremendous potential richness of meaning is lost. Most Chinese and non-Westerners grossly and unwittingly violate basic, if implicit, English functioning and its international standards, while capable first-language English speakers across dialects don't. The higher differences in first languages, along with ethnicity and culture, aren't perceived on the lower Chinese level, and they don't suspect there is further understanding beyond what they have. Native English speakers across dialects communicate at their common background level of complex understanding, including objective and third-person language to describe objective reality, rather than just locally relative and candy floss metaphors. English underwrites the whole scientific basis of the modern world, where China's linguistic butchery matches its technological blind copying. It would be a simple matter to select quality English tuition books for speakers of other languages, prepared and published in one of the major native English-speaking Western countries, with Chinese translations, then added as necessary by either English or Chinese speakers, and hence with errors only on the Chinese side. The insistent and socialist self-sufficient use of coursebooks and materials, including for exams, only written by Chinese who have learnt English, makes clear the mismatch between English accuracy and subtlety and Chinese congestion and hyperbole. There is every kind of extremely unprofessional, stupid error and misjudgment, including in the nature of the learning activities and questions provided, instead of there being issues only with the written Chinese, where they'll be overseen and don't matter. At other times on audio recordings for Chinese English coursebooks, native speakers are used but have been required to read uncorrected writing, while hence struggling to keep their delivery smooth and shaped. Then, even when audio and video are provided from a native speaker country, these are consistently selected with delivery too fast, weak metaphors, boring technical detail, and too long to be analyzed. Again, casual and inarticulate speech for coming in at a parroting level is favored instead of understanding what is actually being said, and transcribing where necessary, and then abbreviating if needed from there. The insistence on Chinese learning materials further expresses the historical fear of the rest of the world and isolationism, where the pushing of the local version of a product, even if it's substandard, is only partly unwitting, and instead partly resentful. They try to learn the international common language, but as ever are afraid of its embodiment of wider international terms. Despite importing technology, the economic system remains an internally commanded and closed autarky, with ongoing restrictions on a huge range of regular international merchandise, while providing the sickly and contrived containment found across the small set of officially communist countries. English is a product of a more conscious and superior people and culture, which, although looking to the secondary intellect as logic and linearity over the primary intuition as interconnection and holism, still all has better grounding than in China. The historical Chinese cultural and political sequestration issues from the wider world being anathema, and where the current desire for trading and speaking with it brings disingenuousness and schizophrenia. Western values of individuality and right-wing politics, with their huge achievements, are evidently superior to values of society and left-wing politics. In the past, China built immense walls to pretend that wider reality is unreal, but it keeps creeping in while showing the parallel internal unreality and fractures of collectivity placed over individuality, even for the limited Chinese. Native English speakers learning a new language understand the need to defer to good native speakers of it for guidance and materials, as they know that languages can be complex and can't be glibly learnt within the learner's own linguistic and cultural terms. Native speakers also define a language, while a core reason for learning is to communicate on their terms and know their environment. Learners don't just learn from others learning English as a second language, who will likely have a lower-level understanding. Average Chinese speakers, however, only learn up to the levels of complexity and representation that they presume from Chinese language, that language in general has, and regard everything further as a matter of relative surface features. Deeper conceptualization, differentiation, expression, shading, and other richness is beyond their mental abilities, ensuing culture and political system, and must pass over them as incomprehensible and meaningless. Nonetheless, substandard Chinese English learning materials, despite being from restrictive, ignorant minds and language, supplied particularly to more capable students, have gross lack of integrity and basic ethics. What Chinese English writers take to be small errors quickly undermine meaning in and make incomprehensible, even moderately complex content, and are inexcusable. Signage in China is so weak it's sometimes only decipherable by a strong native speaker, and indeed is more an attempt to show cosmopolitanism and acknowledgement of international visitors, plus incessant socialist instructions to all persons as presupposing no adult responsibility, than to say anything meaningful per se. Vapid sign writing is then at one with vapid writing of every kind, with there being nothing to say within the necessary perfect Chinese system, crushing the individual mind. By contrast, huge university buildings typically have no signage for where the rooms are, as expressing the real domestic disinclination for transparency or being upfront about anything. Examples of secondary reasons for signs included the high-quality Nanning teaching rooms, having 4 large, glassed, and costly signs bolted onto 3 of the walls throughout all the rooms in use, without, of course, consultation with the foreign expert staff using them. They were absurd in both content and English, reading "Keep Clean," "Keep Silent," and "I Love SCIC" as the sub-college name, plus a symbolic "No Phones or Food." The students were aged 19 to 22 or older, and, of course, hadn't had issues with any of these matters at least since they were young children. The Chinese will reason that although the native speaker perhaps has a deeper understanding, simple English skills are enough for simple signs, without any checking. But very much to the contrary, every level of conception and writing in English has inherent complexity to deal with, if the results aren't to look foolish. I laid out the basics in emails to managers and staff, then covered over the signs in my main room with paper before the dean and vice dean came in to remove it. The main reason for such signs, though, is to express and normalize the childhood condition's extension into adulthood and the need for state shepherding. The university's dogged low English standards were advertised, but putting people down is more important, with maturity and independence being outside of Chinese culture, where instead a higher authority must continue to tell people to do even the simplest and most commonsensical things. Western education systems also involve students' degradation and humiliation for wider control purposes, but it's more blatant in China, without values of individuality. A critical mind's glance at the sign's encroaching crazy presence reveals them obviously as subtle interference and menace, barking down at already troubled students. In one room, a sign had even been fixed upside down, despite also having Chinese script in a corner, and hence disingenuously serving its function, all the better to perplex and make downtrodden and pliant.
Official government rubbish English signage to presuppose deference to the state and deny autonomy, responsibility, self-respect, and even taking care of oneself is everywhere. They presuppose a diminutive condition, which for the Chinese, however, is all largely true, and hence involves less coercion and more genuine partnership between the moronic masses and government. Throughout Nanjing metro stations, a large floor sticker sign in yellow and black danger colors, reading "Mind the Step, warning missing a step," was placed on the floor at the top of multiple staircases. I took my time looking at this and made notes on paper before photographing it, while being noticed by the oppressive security.
As a result, the signs were then replaced with new signs stuck on top that corrected the spelling mistake in warning, but retained the rest of the trash. Signs being out of ignorance and mindlessness towards English segue into being out of deliberate efforts to inflict incomprehension, disorientation, and stress. The cynical demand from the power structure above is only for those below to look out for their next mysterious order and abjectly try to obey and keep out of trouble, while understanding nothing. Moreover, authorities don't want well-written English on signs, as consisting in more detailed thought that connotes critical reflection. Socialism, as already based on centralized directives and downplaying of personal sovereignty, manifests more distinctly than in liberal capitalism the contempt and brutality for the descending hierarchy below. When victims have been abused to the point of them losing resistance, then to degrade them further, orders are given that are impossible to understand, while those above smirk in contempt and hate. The poor English and the repression issue from the same small-mindedness, but the average low consciousness means less real negativity. Government English signs are ostensibly for international visitors, but are never checked while having zero regard for international standard English, and are instead there for more mind-bombing of the Chinese sheep. Westerners are not interested in, nor pushed around by signs telling them to be careful on normal stairs, and instead only become offended and suspicious of where the sign came from. Again, the more developed meaning of English and the more developed meaning of the signs are equally lost on the Chinese. Meanwhile, at the metro stations are Chinese and English announcements every 15 seconds of extreme drivel, instructions about how to proceed, so that time to reflect to oneself, even on platforms, is interrupted. Internet signal provision in stations and trains is also excellent to keep people looking down at worthless and monitorable activity, and discourage even using the journey to talk laterally to each other, or think to oneself in separation from the state. Low-level English writing, without the core implicit and international criteria to give it sense, and instead the writer presupposing their own language's structures, makes meaning break down even faster and not slower when trying to communicate with users also at low levels. If the native speaker can't understand, even with their height of deciphering ability, then no one else can, unless some sort of private pigeon out of speakers of the same language is being senselessly created, where instead they can just speak their own language. English signs in non-Western countries are common language communication for either international visitors as native or second language English speakers, or domestic different language speakers, likewise using English. Taking English as relative and superficial results in silliness and comedy for mature users, where, by contrast, they see immediately that it has implication for far more, and is never operating on a rudimentary or makeshift level, regardless of instances of use for simple content. Fashionable clothing with English writing as vaguely sophisticated for non-Westerners further examples the assumed lack of need, with people being happy to walk around displaying ridiculous or grossly inappropriate wording, and not understanding that some languages go beyond superficiality and have more meaning to be cautious about. China then shows great, if involuntary, determination to be an international joke in its idiotic English on signage for major national projects, including airports, train and metro stations, and electronic machines duplicated many thousands of times across the country. immediately arriving at Beijing Airport immigration, printed up on the wall is "Pay taxes consciously," which is deemed just fine when the spelling of conscientiously, plus the wording and the whole point of the sign are wrong-headed, even if the government is somewhat presumed as important in the process. The country is announced as moronic and ludicrous, but also indeed that it's unconscious. Then, in world-class new metro carriages, the signs are "no tossing," in an unnecessary attempt to mean "no littering," when in British English, meaning "no masturbating," where the Chinese prefer to make a fool of themselves rather than ask somebody beyond themselves about what on earth they're doing. They only know writing as simple characters, conveying simple meaning, and just don't understand. Roughly relevant translating words are there, so clearly there is no problem, and Westerners' comments are overenthusiastic or trying to be clever. The disregard for checking even on the most official levels, where the country represents itself to foreigners for their evaluation, indicates this issues from fundamental reasons of mentality, plus cultural presupposition, and nothing otherwise excusable, like having no strong native speakers around to ask to do checking. However, with everything perfect in China under socialism, also nobody has reason to speak out with suggestions for improvements of any kind, even if they might have the personal critical capacity to see them. Whereas Chinese learning English to a basic level and then preparing signage in it for public use don't think to get it checked by native speakers with good written skills. By contrast, Westerners learning a second language to a basic level and then preparing signage in it for public use in their country would most definitely get it checked by one or more strong native speakers of that language. They would immediately assume from their own experience of language as complex that what they've done might have errors and need improving in numerous ways, so that their work is well received, not laughable. Certainly, Western learners of English as a second language, such as French or German speakers, don't assume that limited study makes them sufficiently proficient not to have important work checked, or that preposterous results aren't possible. In place of awareness of developed grammar and diction in English, or why these might be of any concern if they existed, the Chinese substitute respect, pomposity, and blather for the necessarily simple message they're trying to convey. Rather than attention to the depth and variety of thought English issues, they think that correcting it is equivalent to correcting a janitor's work, as being unskilled and simple, and hence also offensive to the janitor. For the Chinese, standard English is at most a standard arbitrary opinion about, or standard dialect, because the higher critical performance that the articulation and differentiation provide for is beyond their mental capacity. They take substandard English not to be substandard because it parallels lower standards and weakly established forms issuing from their less conscious minds and concomitant simpler language, society, material life, and overall culture that they also identify with personally. Moreover, both international and objective criteria are necessarily beyond the self-sufficient Chinese system and governing party, and hence abhorrent. And, as with everything else in the real, external world that has to be acknowledged as standing on its own, there's a desire to interfere and corrupt, to make it dependent on the state. The centralized administration redirects the existing copying culture for deploying Western technology, and in the process provides for English mistakes being duplicated with demented exactitude across the vast country. China hides complexity and critique delivered from the West under whitewashing surfaces of acceptance and deference, where empty and soulless material development is achieved by an android population in an unassuming empirical country, and where English, as put to the same material ends, loses its spirit and interest. Any questions?